The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ranch as Jake Martinez loaded his last bag of grain onto the wagon. His weathered hands shook slightly as he counted the few coins in his pocket, 3 months behind on the mortgage, and the bank had already sent 2 warning letters. The small cattle ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations was slipping through his fingers like desert sand. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked across the fence line toward the Apache reservation. The land there was vast and untouched, stretching for miles under the endless blue sky. He had grown up hearing stories about the Apache people, but had rarely interacted with them beyond the occasional trade in town. That afternoon, while checking his fence line near the reservation border, Jake heard shouting in the distance. Curious and concerned, he rode his horse toward the commotion. What he found shocked him to his core. A young Apache woman was being dragged toward a group of horses by 3 men. She was tall and strong, fighting against their grip with fierce determination. Her long black hair whipped around her face as she struggled, and her dark eyes blazed with defiance. Jake had never seen anyone fight so bravely. The men were clearly trying to take her somewhere against her will. One of them, a heavy-set man with cruel eyes, kept shouting orders in a language Jake didn't understand. The woman shouted back, her voice strong and unafraid despite being outnumbered. Jake's heart pounded as he watched the scene unfold. His father had always taught him to help those in need, regardless of who they were or where they came from. Without thinking twice, he spurred his horse forward and rode into the group. "Let her go," Jake shouted, drawing his rifle from its holster on his saddle. The 3 men turned in surprise. The heavy-set man sneered at Jake and spoke in broken English. "This not your business, white man. Go away." "I'm making it my business," Jake replied firmly, keeping his rifle steady. "Release her now." The Apache woman looked at Jake with surprise. She had stopped struggling for a moment, clearly wondering why this stranger was interfering. Her eyes were intelligent and proud, and Jake could see she was sizing him up, trying to understand his intentions. The heavy-set man laughed harshly. "You do not know what you do. This woman belonged to Chief Running Bear. She go marry him today. You cannot stop this." The woman spoke up then, her English clear but accented. "I do not belong to anyone, and I will not marry that old man." She looked directly at Jake. "Why do you help me, stranger?" Jake felt something stir in his chest at the sound of her voice. There was strength in it, but also a vulnerability that touched him deeply. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. The standoff continued for several tense minutes. Jake kept his rifle trained on the men, while they argued among themselves in their native language. The woman, who Jake learned was named Ayanna, stood proudly between them all, her chin raised defiantly. Finally, the heavy-set man made a decision. "You want to interfere? Fine, but Chief Running Bear will not be happy. He has already paid bride price for this woman. If you take her from us, you must pay him back, or marry her yourself to honor the agreement." Jake's mind raced. He didn't have money to pay anyone back, but he couldn't just leave this woman to be forced into marriage. "What kind of agreement?" he asked. Ayanna spoke up, her voice bitter. "My father owed Running Bear money. When he died last month, Running Bear claimed I must marry him to pay the debt. It is not our way, but he has convinced the tribal council that it is necessary." Jake's heart sank. This was more complicated than he had realized. But looking at Ayanna's proud, desperate face, he knew he couldn't walk away. "How much money are we talking about?" $200, the heavy-set man said with a smirk. "You have this money, white man." Jake's stomach dropped. $200 was more than he made in 6 months. With his ranch failing, it might as well have been 2,000. But then an idea began to form in his mind. Desperate and crazy though it was, "What if I married her instead?" Jake heard himself saying. "That would honor the agreement, wouldn't it?" The men looked at each other in surprise. Ayanna stared at Jake with wide eyes. "You would do this? You do not even know me." Jake met her gaze steadily. "It would be just on paper," he said quietly, hoping she would understand. "To protect you from being forced into something you don't want." The heavy-set man laughed again. "Chief Running Bear will not accept this. You are not Apache. How can Apache woman marry white man?" "Because," Ayanna said suddenly, her voice growing stronger, "it is my choice to make. If this man is willing to honor the debt through marriage, then the agreement is satisfied. Running Bear cannot argue with that. Jake felt a surge of admiration for her quick thinking. She had found a way out of her impossible situation, and she was brave enough to take it, even though it meant marrying a complete stranger. The negotiation that followed was tense and complicated. The men insisted that Chief Running Bear had to approve any arrangement. Ayanna argued that tribal law gave her the right to choose her husband, especially since her father was dead and she had no male relatives to speak for her. Finally, they reached an agreement. Jake and Ayanna would present themselves to Chief Running Bear within 3 days to formalize the marriage arrangement. If the chief accepted Jake as a suitable husband and the debt was considered paid, then Ayanna would be free from her obligation to marry Running Bear. As the men rode away, grumbling and dissatisfied, Jake found himself alone with Ayanna for the first time. She stood quietly for a moment, looking out across the landscape toward her village. Her profile was strong and beautiful, and Jake found himself wondering what he had gotten himself into. "You have saved me from a terrible fate," she said finally, turning to look at him. "But you have also bound yourself to a stranger. Why would you do such a thing?" Jake thought about how to answer. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. Something about her courage and dignity had moved him in a way he had never experienced before. "Everyone deserves the right to choose their own path," he said. "And you were fighting so hard for yours." Ayanna nodded slowly. "What is your name?" "Jake Martinez. I own the ranch just across the fence line there." He gestured toward his property. "What about you? Besides Ayanna, I mean. Tell me about yourself." "I am Ayanna Crowfeather. My father was a medicine man, and he taught me to read and write in both Apache and English. I help care for the sick and injured in our village." She paused, studying his face. "This marriage you propose, it is only to save me from Running Bear?" Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I meant what I said about it being just on paper. I wouldn't expect anything from you that you weren't willing to give freely." Something shifted in Ayanna's expression, a softening around her eyes. "You are an honorable man, Jake Martinez. I pray that Chief Running Bear will see this as well." As they walked back toward the fence line between their properties, Jake found himself stealing glances at his soon-to-be bride. She moved with the grace of someone completely comfortable in the wilderness, and her presence had a calming effect he hadn't expected. "What will you tell your people about this?" Ayanna asked as they reached the fence. Jake laughed ruefully. "I'm not sure they'll believe me. A week ago I was a failing rancher about to lose everything to the bank. Now I'm about to marry an Apache woman to save her from a forced marriage. It sounds like something out of a dime novel." "And what about losing everything to the bank?" Ayanna asked quietly. Jake was surprised by her directness, but also touched that she cared enough to ask. "The ranch is in trouble. Has been for a while. I've got about a month before they take it away from me." They reached his horse, and Jake prepared to mount up. "I'll come to your village tomorrow to speak with Chief Running Bear. Where should I meet you?" Ayanna gave him detailed directions to her village, then paused. "Jake Martinez, I want you to know that even if this arrangement is only temporary, I will honor it completely while it lasts. You are giving me my freedom, and that is worth more than any dowry or bride price." As Jake rode back to his ranch, his mind was spinning with everything that had happened. In the space of a few hours, his life had completely changed direction. He was about to enter into a marriage with a woman he had just met, to save her from a fate she dreaded. But as he thought about Ayanna's courage and dignity, about the way she had stood up to those men and the way she had looked at him with gratitude and respect, Jake realized he didn't regret his decision. Whatever happened with Chief Running Bear, whatever complications this arrangement might bring, he had done the right thing. That night, as he sat on his porch looking across the fence toward the Apache reservation, Jake wondered what tomorrow would bring. He had always lived a simple, predictable life on his ranch. Now he was about to enter a world completely different from his own, and he had no idea what to expect. But for the first time in months, since the bank troubles had started weighing so heavily on him, Jake felt a sense of purpose and hope. He was going to marry Ayanna Crowfeather, and somehow they would figure out how to make this arrangement work for both of them. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Jake had barely slept, his mind racing through everything that could go wrong when he met with Chief Running Bear. He dressed carefully in his best clothes, cleaned his boots, and made sure his horse was properly groomed. First impressions would be crucial. As he rode toward the Apache village, Jake's stomach churned with nervous energy. The landscape gradually changed from his familiar ranch land to the wilder, more rugged terrain of the reservation. Ancient rock formations jutted up from the earth like monuments, and the sparse vegetation gave the land a timeless, sacred quality. The village was larger than Jake had expected, with dozens of traditional dwellings spread across a natural basin, surrounded by red stone cliffs. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and he could see people going about their daily activities. Children played between the buildings while women worked on various tasks, and men tended to horses. Jake's arrival caused quite a stir. Conversations stopped, and people turned to stare at the white man riding into their village. He felt dozens of eyes upon him, some curious, some suspicious, some openly hostile. The weight of their attention made him acutely aware that he was an outsider in their world. Ayanna appeared from one of the larger dwellings, and Jake felt a sense of relief at seeing her familiar face. She had braided her long hair and wore traditional Apache dress, but her bearing was just as proud and strong as it had been the day before. She walked toward him with confidence, despite the obvious tension his presence had created. "You came," she said simply, but Jake could hear the gratitude in her voice. "I said I would," Jake replied, dismounting from his horse. "Are you ready for this?" Before Ayanna could answer, a deep voice boomed across the village square. "So, the white man thinks he can take what belongs to Running Bear." Jake turned to see a tall, imposing figure striding toward them. Chief Running Bear was older than Jake had expected, perhaps in his 50s, but still powerfully built and radiating authority. His weathered face was set in hard lines, and his dark eyes glittered with anger and challenge. Behind Running Bear walked several other men, clearly his supporters and advisors. Jake could feel the mood of the village shift as people gathered to witness the confrontation. This was obviously a moment that would be talked about for years to come. "Chief Running Bear," Ayanna said formally, stepping slightly forward. "I present Jake Martinez, who has offered to honor my father's debt through marriage, as is my right under tribal law." Running Bear looked Jake up and down with obvious disdain. "Your father owed me money and horses," he said to Ayanna, not acknowledging Jake at all. "I offered to take you as my wife to settle this debt. It was a generous offer. Now you bring this stranger and expect me to accept him instead." Jake stepped forward, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Chief Running Bear, I understand you feel wronged by this situation, but Ayanna has the right to choose her husband, and she has chosen me. I'm willing to work to pay off her father's debt in whatever way you think is fair." Running Bear finally looked directly at Jake, his expression cold and calculating. "What do you know of our ways, white man? What do you know of honor and obligation? I know that forcing a woman into marriage against her will isn't honorable in any culture," Jake replied, meeting the chief's stare steadily. A murmur went through the gathered crowd at Jake's boldness. Running Bear's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment Jake thought the chief might strike him. But then the older man smiled, and somehow that was more frightening than his anger had been. "You speak of honor?" Running Bear said slowly. "Very well. We will see how much honor you truly have. You wish to take this woman as your wife? Then you must prove you are worthy of her and capable of paying the debt." Jake felt his heart sink. He had expected this wouldn't be simple, but the chief's tone suggested something much more challenging than just a negotiation. "What do you require?" "3 trials, Running Bear announced, his voice carrying across the village. 3 tests to prove you are worthy to be husband to Apache woman and to take on the debts of her family." Ayanna stepped closer to Jake, and he could sense her concern. "What kind of trials?" she asked. Running Bear's smile grew broader and less pleasant. "First, you must prove you can provide for a wife. You will hunt with our best hunters and bring back meat for the village feast. If you fail, you are not worthy." Jake nodded slowly. He was a decent hunter, though he had never hunted in Apache territory or with Apache methods. "And the second trial? You must prove you have courage and can defend what is yours. You will face our strongest warrior in combat. Not to death," Running Bear added with mock generosity, "but until one of you yields or cannot continue." Jake's mouth went dry. He was strong from ranch work and had been in a few fights in his life, but facing a trained Apache warrior was a completely different matter. "And the third trial?" "The third trial will be revealed only if you survive the first 2. Running Bear said. Do you accept these challenges? White man. Jake looked at Ayanna, seeing worry and something else in her dark eyes. Was it admiration? Hope? He thought about walking away, about the relative safety of his failing ranch and his predictable problems with the bank. But then he remembered the way Ayanna had fought against her captors, the dignity and strength she had shown in an impossible situation. I accept, Jake said firmly. The crowd erupted in excited chatter. This was clearly the most interesting thing that had happened in the village for some time. Running Bear looked pleased, as if Jake had walked directly into a trap he had carefully set. The first trial begins at dawn tomorrow, the chief announced. Tonight, you will be guest in our village. Ayanna Crowfeather will show you our ways and prepare you for what comes. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake found himself alone with Ayanna for the first time since arriving. She led him to a small dwelling on the edge of the village, explaining that it had belonged to her father and was now hers. You did not have to accept the trials, she said as they settled near a small fire inside the dwelling. Running Bear was hoping to make this impossible for you. I figured as much, Jake replied. But I couldn't back down now. Besides, how hard can it be? Ayanna looked at him with a mixture of affection and exasperation. Jake Martinez, you are either very brave or very foolish. Running Bear's hunters know every animal trail for 50 miles in any direction. They can track prey across solid rock and kill a deer with a single arrow from horseback. Jake felt his confidence wobble a bit. And the warrior I'll have to fight? Thundercloud. He has never lost a battle, and he has been fighting since he was 12 years old. He is Running Bear's nephew, and completely loyal to him. Jake stared into the fire, beginning to understand the full scope of what he had gotten himself into. Ayanna, if I fail these trials, what happens to you? She was quiet for a long moment. I become Running Bear's wife, as he originally demanded. And you? She paused. I do not know what Running Bear will do to you, but it will not be pleasant. He does not like to be challenged, especially by outsiders. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Ayanna spoke again. Why are you doing this, Jake? Really? You could still walk away. Tell Running Bear you changed your mind. Jake looked at her across the flickering firelight. In the traditional dress and setting, she looked even more beautiful than she had the day before. But it was more than that. There was something about her spirit, her intelligence and courage, that drew him like nothing ever had. Because you deserve better than being traded like a piece of property, he said. And because... He paused, not sure how to put his feelings into words. Because from the moment I saw you fighting those men, I knew I couldn't just walk away. Ayanna's eyes softened, and she reached out to touch his hand gently. You barely know me. I know enough, Jake replied. I know you're brave and intelligent and kind. I know you care for others and stand up for what's right. That's more than I've learned about most people I've known for years. A small smile played at the corners of Ayanna's mouth. And I know you are honorable and willing to risk everything for a stranger. That tells me much about your character. They spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing stories about their lives and backgrounds. Jake told Ayanna about growing up on the ranch, about his parents who had died when he was young, about the struggles of trying to keep the family land. Ayanna told him about her father, the medicine man, about learning to read and write, about her work helping the sick and injured. As the night grew later, Jake felt a connection growing between them that went far beyond their practical arrangement. Ayanna was unlike any woman he had ever met, and he found himself genuinely caring about her thoughts and opinions, not just her situation. Tomorrow will be dangerous, Ayanna said as they prepared to sleep. Running Bear has chosen his best hunter to accompany you. Starwalker has never returned from a hunt without game. Jake nodded, trying to appear more confident than he felt. I'll figure it out. I have to. There is something else, Ayanna said hesitantly. If by some chance you succeed in all the trials, our marriage will be real and binding according to Apache law. Running Bear is counting on you to fail. But if you do not, we'll deal with that when it happens, Jake said gently. Right now, let's just focus on getting through tomorrow. As Jake settled down to sleep, his mind was already working on strategies for the hunt. He would need every advantage he could get if he wanted to survive the trials and save Ayanna from a marriage she didn't want. The stakes had never been higher, and failure wasn't an option. Dawn came too quickly, with a pale orange light spreading across the desert landscape. Jake had managed only a few hours of restless sleep, his mind churning with worry about the trials ahead. He rose stiffly and found Ayanna already awake, preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal and dried fruit. "Starwalker is already waiting," she said quietly, gesturing toward the village center where Jake could see a lean, sharp-eyed Apache man checking his bow and arrows. "He looks confident." Jake studied his competition from a distance. Starwalker moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness, and his equipment was clearly well-maintained and frequently used. Everything about the man spoke of years of successful hunting experience. "Remember," Ayanna said as Jake prepared to leave, "it is not just about killing the largest animal. The hunt is judged on skill, efficiency, and bringing back enough meat to feed many people. Think like an Apache, not like a white rancher." Jake nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what she meant. His hunting experience was limited to occasional deer hunting for his own table. Nothing like the communal hunting the Apache practiced. The hunting party consisted of Jake, Starwalker, and 2 other Apache men who would serve as judges and witnesses. Running Bear addressed them before they departed, speaking mainly in Apache but switching to English when he wanted Jake to understand. "You have until sunset to return with your kill," the chief announced. "Whoever brings back the most valuable game wins the trial. Starwalker, show this white man what a real hunter can do." Starwalker grinned and said something in Apache that made the other men laugh. Jake suspected it wasn't complimentary, but he kept his expression neutral and focused on the task ahead. They rode out into the desert wilderness, following ancient game trails that were invisible to Jake but clearly well known to his companions. The landscape was harsh and beautiful, with towering red rock formations and sparse vegetation that somehow supported a surprising variety of wildlife. After about an hour of riding, Starwalker called a halt and spoke to the judges in rapid Apache. Then he turned to Jake with a mocking smile. "We separate here. White man, you take the North Canyon, I take the South. May the better hunter win." Jake found himself alone for the first time since arriving at the village. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the rocks and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. He had perhaps 8 hours to find, track, and kill game worthy of an Apache feast. For the first few hours, Jake struggled. He found animal tracks but lost them on the rocky ground. He spotted deer in the distance but couldn't get close enough for a clean shot. His horse, while well-trained for ranch work, was not accustomed to the silent movement required for hunting in Apache territory. By midday, Jake was beginning to panic. The sun was directly overhead, meaning half his time was gone, and he had nothing to show for it. He dismounted and sat in the shade of a large boulder, trying to think clearly about his situation. That's when he remembered something his father had told him years ago. When you're in unfamiliar territory, stop trying to impose your way, and start learning from the land itself. Jake closed his eyes and listened, really listened. Gradually, he began to pick up sounds he had been missing. Water trickling somewhere nearby, the rustle of small animals in the brush, the different calls of various birds, some of which might indicate the presence of larger game. Following the sound of water, Jake discovered a small spring hidden in a narrow canyon. The area around it was crisscrossed with animal tracks of various sizes. This was clearly a popular watering spot, which meant if he was patient, animals would come to him. Jake found a good hiding spot downwind from the spring and settled in to wait. It went against every instinct he had developed as a rancher, where action and constant movement were usually the solution to problems. But hunting required a different mindset, one of patience and harmony with the natural world. His patience was rewarded when a small herd of deer approached the spring in the late afternoon. Jake managed to bring down a large buck with a single clean shot, then quickly field-dressed the animal and loaded it onto his horse. But as he prepared to return to the village, Jake heard something that stopped him cold. Somewhere in the distance, a horse was neighing in distress, and he could hear a man shouting. It sounded like one of the Apache hunters was in trouble. Jake knew he should head straight back to the village with his kill. His trial was essentially complete, and he had a good chance of passing if Starwalker hadn't found anything larger than his deer. But the sound of distress continued, and his conscience wouldn't let him ignore it. Following the sounds, Jake found Starwalker trapped beneath his fallen horse in a narrow ravine. The horse had apparently stepped wrong on the loose rocks and fallen, pinning the Apache hunter beneath it. Starwalker was conscious but clearly in pain, and the horse was struggling weakly, which made the situation even more dangerous. For a moment, Jake hesitated. This was the man who was competing against him, who would probably beat him in the trial if he was able to complete the hunt. Helping Starwalker could cost Jake everything, including Ayana's freedom. But then Jake thought about what Ayana had said about honor and character, and he knew what he had to do. Working carefully, Jake managed to calm the injured horse and create a lever system using dead tree branches to lift the animal enough for Starwalker to crawl free. The Apache hunter's leg was badly injured, but he was alive and conscious. "Why do you help me?" Starwalker asked as Jake bandaged his leg with torn strips from his own shirt. "Because it's the right thing to do," Jake replied, the same words he had used with Ayana 2 days earlier. Starwalker studied Jake's face for a long moment. "You could have left me here. Won the trial easily." "That wouldn't be winning," Jake said. "That would be succeeding because of someone else's misfortune. I want to earn Ayana's freedom fairly. Or not at all." Something changed in Starwalker's expression. The mockery and hostility were gone, replaced by what looked like respect. "You are not what I expected, white man." Jake helped Starwalker onto his horse, then recovered the Apache hunter's impressive kill, a large elk that was certainly more valuable than Jake's deer. As they rode back toward the village together, Jake knew he had probably just lost the first trial, but he felt oddly at peace with his decision. The village was buzzing with excitement when they returned. Word quickly spread that Starwalker had been injured and Jake had rescued him, even though it meant losing the hunting competition. Running Bear's expression was unreadable as he examined both kills and listened to Starwalker's account of what had happened. "Starwalker has brought back the larger game," the chief announced finally. But the white man showed great courage and honor in rescuing his competitor. "This trial is difficult to judge." The village elders conferred for several minutes, speaking in rapid Apache while Jake waited nervously. Finally, the eldest among them stood and addressed the crowd. "We have decided that both men have proven themselves today," the elder announced. Starwalker showed his hunting skills, and Jake Martinez showed his character. The first trial is declared a tie, and both men advanced to the second challenge. Jake felt a surge of relief and gratitude, but he also noticed the angry look on Running Bear's face. The chief had clearly expected Jake to fail miserably in the first trial, and the tie had disrupted his plans. The second trial, combat with Thundercloud, was scheduled for the following morning. Jake spent the evening talking with Ayana about what to expect and trying to prepare himself mentally for facing a trained warrior. "Thundercloud is strong and skilled," Ayana warned him, "but he is also proud and sometimes impatient. If you can avoid his first few attacks and tire him out, you might have a chance." Jake nodded, though he suspected avoiding Thundercloud's attacks would be easier said than done. He had never been in a formal combat situation like this, and he was facing an opponent with years of training and experience. The next morning, the entire village gathered to watch the second trial. A large circle was cleared in the village center, and traditional drums began beating as the two men prepared to fight. Thundercloud was indeed an imposing figure, tall and muscular with intricate tattoos covering his arms and chest. "Combat is until one man yields or cannot continue," Running Bear announced. "No weapons, only hands and strength." The fight began with Thundercloud charging forward like a bull, clearly intending to overwhelm Jake with his superior strength and speed. Jake barely managed to dodge the initial attack, stumbling backward as Thundercloud's fist whistled past his ear. For the first several minutes, Jake was completely on the defensive, using every ounce of agility he possessed to avoid Thundercloud's powerful strikes. The Apache warrior was incredibly fast and strong, and Jake quickly realized that trying to match him blow for blow would be suicide. Instead, Jake focused on movement and patience, the same qualities that had served him well during the hunt. He let Thundercloud expend energy on attacks that missed or were only partially successful, while Jake looked for opportunities to strike back. The opportunity came when Thundercloud, growing frustrated with Jake's evasive tactics, committed too much to a powerful overhead strike. Jake managed to sidestep the attack and land a solid punch to Thundercloud's ribs, drawing a grunt of pain from the warrior. This seemed to enrage Thundercloud, who abandoned his disciplined approach and began fighting with pure fury. But anger made him sloppy, and Jake was able to avoid most of his wild swings while landing several more effective counterattacks. The fight continued for nearly an hour, both men becoming exhausted and bloodied. Jake's strategy of patience and endurance was working, but he was reaching the limits of his own stamina. He needed to end the fight soon, before Thundercloud's superior conditioning gave him the advantage. Jake's opportunity came when Thundercloud slipped slightly on the sandy ground. Jake managed to get behind the warrior and apply a chokehold he had learned from a former soldier who worked on neighboring ranch. Thundercloud struggled powerfully, but Jake held on grimly until the Apache warrior finally tapped Jake's arm in submission. The crowd erupted in shocked cheers and applause. No one, including Jake himself, had expected him to defeat Thundercloud. Running Bear's face was dark with anger and disbelief, but he had no choice but to acknowledge Jake's victory. "The white man has won the second trial," the chief announced, through gritted teeth. "He will face the third and final challenge tomorrow." As Jake cleaned his wounds and accepted congratulations from village members, he realized that something fundamental had changed. Many of the Apache people who had viewed him with suspicion and hostility when he arrived were now looking at him with respect and acceptance. Ayana tended to his injuries that evening, her touch gentle but her expression worried. "You have done amazingly well," she said. "But Running Bear is furious. He never expected you to pass even the first trial, let alone defeat Thundercloud. The third trial will be something very difficult." "What do you think it will be?" Jake asked. Ayana shook her head. "I do not know. But Running Bear will not make the same mistake again. He will choose something he is absolutely certain you cannot succeed at." That night, as Jake lay trying to rest his battered body, he thought about everything that had led him to this moment. A week ago, he had been a failing rancher facing the loss of his family's land. Now he was on the verge of either winning the freedom of a remarkable woman or facing consequences he couldn't even imagine. But as he drifted off to sleep, Jake realized that regardless of what happened in the final trial, he had already gained something valuable. He had discovered courage and strength within himself that he hadn't known existed, and he had found in Ayana a woman who challenged and inspired him in ways no one ever had. The third trial would determine both their fates, but Jake was no longer afraid. Whatever Running Bear had planned, Jake would face it with the same determination and honor that had brought him this far. Ayana's freedom, and perhaps their future together, depended on it.